We're getting Phantom Revenge in just a couple of weeks now, so I wanted to use this video to keep you all informed on what to expect from the set, as well as how it will impact the meta overall. Phantom Revenge is one of those side deck building sets, kind of like Justice Hunters, where there's going to be 3 different archetypes in there, with some potential archetype related reprints. At the time of recording, none of those reprints have been revealed just yet, but generally with these sets, we'll see some pretty solid reprints for cards that are going to be good in all of these decks. Speaking of the decks, we're getting 3 new archetypes in this set, that being Killer Tune, Hecahands, and Enneacraft, and I'll be talking about every single one of them, and I'll also be discussing their meta implications. Just a quick explanation of how I'm going to be rating this. For this video and for future videos like this, I'm going to be giving either new cards or new archetypes like different ratings, so you guys have a better idea of how relevant I think it is to the meta. These ratings are strictly just how impactful these cards are going to be to the competitive metagame overall. So it's not saying anything about how interesting or cool the cards are. So 5 stars is going to be something that's going to be immediately impactful in the meta. 4 stars is going to be something that seems pretty solid, but may not be meta relevant right away. They might need a few extra support cards, or they just need to wait for the right format for them to be good. 3 stars, I think these are card or archetypes that have some potential meta impact, but they probably need a lot of help and a lot of things to sort of align for them to really have any meaningful impact on the metagame overall. 2 stars, I think these probably won't do anything in the meta, but are fairly interesting cards. I wouldn't say these cards are bad by any means, but they just don't really have a place in the metagame. And then finally, 1 star, these cards or archetypes I think are just bulk and will have 0 meta relevance at all. Alright, so starting off with the first archetype we're getting, that being Hecahands. In my opinion, this is probably going to be 3 out of 5 stars. I think overall the archetype is kind of interesting. There's potential here. I don't think it's going to have any meta impact right away. The way the Hecahands deck works is it's a fusion deck that sort of has a gimmick on taking your opponent's cards. Basically, the whole gimmick of the deck is like, I'll summon out my monsters, they all have effects to sort of take your opponent's cards. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the cons, but I actually don't really see a clear direction for this deck, which is why I am keeping it at the 3 stars. That being said though, I would say this deck has potential because even in this first wave of support, it already has really good consistency cards. They're not in any of the pictures here, but they have 2 cards that basically like shuffle themselves from the hand into the deck and then just like add a Hecahands monster or spell or trap from the deck, along with some other bonus effects when they're fused off. So that type of consistency card is already of really high quality and definitely makes it so if this deck ever gets some really good support, it can be pretty consistent. This deck also has searchable negates. Like I mentioned, they have those trap cards that are able to steal your opponent's cards. And within the deck, there are a couple of different ways you can get access to your Hecahands traps, meaning that when this deck is able to play the game, they are able to search out these interruptions. And of course, as we all know, counter traps are some of the best interaction in the game since your opponent can't do anything about it. And then finally, perhaps the most interesting part about this archetype is actually one of their main monsters called Hecahands Goddess, the one you see in the picture right here. Even if Hecahands as a deck doesn't do anything and is completely irrelevant, this is still a very interesting card because it can be used as sort of a generic hand trap. When your opponent adds a card from their deck to the hand, except during their draw phase, you can special summon it from your hand, and then during your opponent's main phase, you could actually target a monster in your opponent's graveyard and just special summon it to your field. This can act as like a pseudo Bestial, taking an opponent's like key monster out of the graveyard. The crazy thing is this card doesn't even negate the effects and doesn't put any restriction on the monster that you're summoning. If it's a generic monster with a good effect, or if it's a monster that's really important to your opponent's strategy, you can kind of keep it hostage on your side of the board, which I think is really cool for a hand trap because we don't really have any other hand trap that can kind of do this at the moment. So I would say that this card specifically has a ton of potential, even if this deck ends up not doing anything. Overall, I do think that this deck has a ton of potential for the future just because the card quality is fairly good on most of the cards. But I would say the biggest downside of this deck is that it is somewhat dependent on RNG. So I don't show every single monster here, but some of the monsters in the deck have effects like take a random card from your opponent's hand. If it's a monster, you can summon it to your field. Like look at the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. If you find any monsters, you can summon it to your side of the field. So that sort of game plan does rely a bit on RNG. You kind of have to get lucky, and so there is that element of inconsistency in every game that you play. Like maybe some games you'll hit the perfect cards, or other games you won't hit anything at all, and that can just kind of make the experience with the deck pretty inconsistent and not very competitively viable. I also feel like this deck lacks a solid game plan. I did mention at the start it is a fusion deck, and they do have like solid fusion cards and like a solid fusion spell, but then the overall game plan of the deck is kind of confusing since it does kind of rely on taking your opponent's cards. It's kind of hard to know, like, am I supposed to go second and steal a bunch of cards with like my main deck monsters? Am I supposed to go first, try to set up like some sort of interruptions by just using my own monsters at first? So I think it's kind of hard, at least at the moment, to sort of determine where this deck is going to end up and what its game plan really should be. So I think until we get either more support or someone tinkers with this deck and figures something out. I think this deck is just a little too inconsistent, and there's just too much unknown about this deck for me to really say it'll have a strong meta impact overall. But once again, like I said, I can maybe see this archetype having some potential in the future if it does get really good support, or if this Hecahands hand trap actually ends up being really good in a certain meta game. Alright, so the next archetype I'm going to talk about is Killer Tune. And I would give Killer Tune a 4 out of 5 stars, meaning I think that they're not going to be necessarily be meta relevant right away, but I think that this archetype can definitely be meta relevant in the future just because of how good the cards are. The gimmick of this deck is that they synchro summon only using tuner monsters, and similar to like the Kotalker stuff, they can actually use materials in the hand for their synchro summon. So that means you don't have to commit bodies onto the board, which can get removed by your opponent. You can simply just put one of the monsters on the board, and then all of them have the effect to where if this card on the field be used as synchro material, one tuner in your hand can be used as one of the other materials. So with this deck, you never really have to commit too much of your hand onto the board, which can be really good at getting around removal from your opponent. The quality of cards are all really good. Like I mentioned, all the monsters have the effect to where like they can use the synchro material in hand. They also have some sort of plus effect on summon, like either adding a card or summoning a Killer Tune from the deck. Killer Tune Clip here is the only one which doesn't do that, but Killer Tune Clip is basically a hand trap because you can summon it out onto your field during your opponent's turn 0 and then synchro summon is something there, which is really cool. And not to mention, their spells and traps, most of them are also pretty high quality and fit really well into the theme of the deck. So I would say the cards definitely are very good by modern standards, and because they have that gimmick using materials in hand, it's pretty hard for your opponent to really handle the interruptions that you're setting up. A lot of times they won't know what you have in hand. I believe there are 4 different Killer Tune synchro monsters which all have different interruption effects, and if your Killer Tune opponent just doesn't reveal like what materials that they have in their hand, it's going to be really hard to sort of read what your opponent's trying to go for and make it difficult to perfectly play around the different Killer Tune interruptions. Not only will the synchro monsters have effects, but all the small Killer Tune monsters, when they're synchroed off, they'll all have bonus disruption effects as well. Another neat part about this archetype is that like they do have quite a bit of recursion for tuners, meaning you are able to recycle hand traps fairly well. So cards like Ash Blossom, cards like Ghost Stoker, if you ever resolve one in this deck, sort of like Dracotail, you can essentially keep looping it again and again, which I also think is a nice bonus for this deck. I think there's definitely a ton of potential and a lot of upsides to this archetype, and it's already looking really good even with this first wave of support. But I would say maybe the biggest weakness of this archetype is that it's really limited in what its extra deck can play. So because every single monster in this deck is going to be a tuner, you're going to only be able to synchro summon synchro monsters that are able to take multiple tuners, and there just aren't that many of those synchro monsters out there, especially those outside of the Killer Tune archetype. For the extra deck, you're going to be kind of limited to what you can end up summoning, and that can be pretty bad in the sense that if you don't have let's say a specific Killer Tune monster that can handle a certain situation that maybe a generic extra deck card like SP Little Knight can, it can make the deck feel a little bit restrictive at times. I do feel like unless we start getting like more and more Killer Tune synchro monsters that are able to fill different niches, this deck is going to be lacking a little bit in what it can do. So overall, even though I think that the cards in this deck are really good, and I do think that this deck's like playstyle, this deck's game plan, and like what this deck is capable of is strong enough to be meta relevant, I think that right now, until we get a little bit of a nerf to the meta overall, this deck is still going to be slightly behind some of these other archetypes that we have, but I can definitely see this deck being good in the future, especially if we get future waves of support too. And then finally, for the last archetype, we have Enneacraft. And I would give this archetype overall a 2 out of 5 stars. I personally think this is the worst archetype that we're getting out of the set. But that being said though, it is an interesting one at least. This is an archetype comprised of pendulum flip monsters that sort of act like counter trap cards. Basically, the whole gimmick of the deck is like all their monsters have the effect to where you can reveal it in hand and then summon any monster from your hand face down. And then all of them have the effect to where if your opponent does a certain action, so let's say they target a card you control, they add a card from deck to the hand, something like that, the face down monsters actually have an effect where they get to flip face up, and they sort of act like a counter trap card in that sense, to where they're responding directly to one thing your opponent does. Then all of them have a different effect when they're flip face up, so some of them can like non-targeting bounce cards to the hand, other ones can just like add extra follow-up from their deck to the hand. So there are like a ton of main deck monsters for this deck, and all of them do something different. I think the biggest appeal of this deck is that since a lot of the monsters also have like bonus effects in the pendulum scales, to where you can sort of like Pantheism of the Monarchs, reveal 3 Enneacraft cards, and your opponent like picks one to add to your hand. I think that means this deck should be fairly consistent. Like just as a quick example, if you open one of the monsters that's able to reveal 3, you can simply use it, reveal 3 of another monster with that same pendulum effect to reveal 3, and then use that one to reveal 3 copies of the field spell. Activate field spell. Field spell is going to be able to bounce both of those scales back to the hand, and then immediately off of a single card, you get a +2, you get the field spell, and you get back both of your pendulum scales to then summon out to your field. So that alone, I think, makes the deck already fairly consistent. I also think that there's some outplay potential with this deck, and some room for mind games. Because like I mentioned, all of them have the same effect to reveal themselves in hand, but you can summon any monster from your hand face down. So if you just, let's say, have a hand of 5 Enneacraft monsters, if you just reveal a single one to your opponent and then just summon 4 monsters like face down, your opponent's not going to know what they need to play around. Even if they know like what every single one of the Enneacraft monsters does, it's going to be difficult for them to know how to properly play around your board and what they need to avoid doing to not trigger your effects. So I think that's sort of a cool gimmick with this deck. A lot of the times, your interruptions are going to be unknown to your opponent, and it's going to be difficult for them to play around in some circumstances. That being said, though, while I think this is a pretty cool gimmick, ultimately, it is very reliant on what your opponent does. Like, for example, like I mentioned, one of the conditions is if your opponent targets one card you control. Like, if they just never target any card you control, that specific Enneacraft monster can never flip up on their opponent's turn and never be used to interrupt your opponent that way. Not to mention, if your opponent actually knows what the different conditions on the most impactful Enneacraft monsters are, they can simply avoid taking those actions, just play around those cards the whole time. Because at least at the moment, with the first wave of support, there isn't a really consistent way for them to flip up their face down monsters like on demand. So I do think that that's a very big weakness of this deck. Your opponent can technically play around all your interruptions if they are able to read what they are. And another downside of the deck is that it is a control strategy. These types of strategies where like you're very reliant on like slowly generated resources, just interrupting your opponent with like 1 or 2 cards on their turn depending on like what they do, can be a little bit slow. And I think this deck is going to struggle a little bit to keep up with some of the other decks that we have in the metagame. So overall, while I think that this is a very interesting archetype, and I don't think the cards are bad by any means, I just feel like this style of gameplay is just not one that I would expect to be good in any future metagame unless the format slows to a point where these types of strategies are good. So for now, on the first wave, I'd give it a 2 stars. These are cool and interesting cards, but I think they're very unlikely to be meta relevant anytime soon. So just as a overview for the entire set, I would give this entire set a 3 stars. I would say that there's potential for future meta impact in this set. I think that all the archetypes are unlikely to see any significant meta impact on their release, and until we get like future support or until we get a big ban list that's able to take out a lot of the threats that we have in the meta game currently, I don't think any of these decks are going to be doing too well anytime soon. That being said, though, like I talked about for all of them, the cards in these archetypes are not bad by any means. There's definitely decent future meta potential for all 3 of these archetypes depending on which future support they get, but it's really hard to say how good the support they're going to get in the future is. So overall, my verdict is it's okay, I guess, if you're interested in one of the specific archetypes and you find them interesting to play, but I don't think this set is very impactful to the metagame overall, at least on its release, because it really does rely on these decks getting future support or the game getting some kind of ban list to make these decks a little bit more competitive. Before I end off the video, I just want to give a quick shout out to CardTrader. CardTrader is an online marketplace where you can buy and sell cards, and they have a service called CardTrader Zero, which allows you to combine shipping if you buy from multiple sellers, saving you on shipping fees. If this sounds like something you're interested in, be sure to sign up in the description using my affiliate link and use code TCGSAM for 5% off your next order while helping to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate that. I also want to say that only a very small percentage of my viewers are subscribed, so if you guys got something useful out of this, and if you would like to see more of these videos in the future, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a quick second to check if you're subscribed to the channel. It really does help keep me more motivated to keep posting more videos like this in the future, and it lets me know that you guys enjoy this type of content. Also, let me know in the comments if you want to see more videos like this in the future where I review like key cards or key archetypes in every single future set release. I think it'll offer a nice sneak peek into a potential future metagame, but let me know what you guys think. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.